Hello, everyone. I am going to start discussing some specific works of literature and kind of show you how to look at these from a writer's perspective. Instead of looking at them, as some of you might have learned, instead of looking at them from an academic perspective. So, when we read as writers, usually we're reading a little bit more actively and we are kind of trying to look at how the writer structures the story, how they pace the story, how they, the language they use, how they create humor, how they create tension. So we're not looking at these stories from a literary, like a literary theory, like feminism or Marxism, etc. We're looking at them more as writers. The more you read, the better you're going to be able to spot things in stories. You'll be a little bit more accurate because you're kind of watching, okay, well, what moves did this author make? What can I kind of borrow, or what can I even potentially steal in this sense? So this is a story by Donald Barthelme called The School. And it's a very famous story. It's considered postmodern fiction, which is to say, postmodern fiction has some similarities to the postmodern philosophical movement, although they're very, very different in a lot of ways. Postmodernism, in a philosophical sense, we might say, means that, or wants to believe that, or says that all meaning is essentially meaningless. Now, I don't want to go into it. I'm not a huge fan of deconstruction and postmodernism. I think it's kind of nihilistic, so to speak. But postmodern writers like Barthelme really tried to break down the associations that we normally had with a short story. What's a short story supposed to do? It's supposed to tell a story and have a plot and all this. Barthelme is a good example of a postmodern writer that breaks down sense and meaning in his stories, usually to comic effect. I like him. Some people don't. I remember teaching this story last semester at UB, and this story alone really confused a lot of the students. So I just want to go through it, kind of open up a little discussion, and so that when you read it or reread it, you can see what Barthelme is doing in it. One moment. Here's that old lecture we already talked about. Okay, so I'm going to actually just read this. It's a very short little piece. Where's mine? Okay. So I'm just going to read through this and kind of show you a few moves that Barthelme makes in it, and then hopefully you can find the humor in it just as much as I do. So it's very short. The school. Well, we had all these children out planting trees, see, because we figured that was part of their education, to see how, the root systems, and also the sense of responsibility, taking care of things, being individually responsible. You know what I mean. And the trees all died. They were orange trees. I don't know why they died. They just died. Something wrong with the soil possibly, or maybe the stuff we got from the nursery wasn't the best. We complained about it. So we've got 30 kids there. Each kid has his or her own little tree to plant, and we've got these 30 dead trees. All these kids looking at these little brown sticks. It was depressing. It wouldn't have been so bad, except that just a couple of weeks before the thing with the trees, the snakes all died. But I think that the snakes, well, the reason that the snakes kicked off was that, you remember, the boiler was shut off for 4 days because of the strike, and that was explicable. It was something you could explain to the kids because of the strike. I mean, none of their parents would let them cross the picket line, and they knew there was a strike going on and what it meant. So when things got started up again, we found the snakes, and they weren't too disturbed. With the herb gardens, it was probably a case of overwatering, and at least now, they know not to overwater. The children were very conscientious with the herb gardens, and some of them probably, slipped them a little extra water when we weren't looking. Or maybe, well, I don't like to think about sabotage, although it did occur to us. I mean, it was something that crossed our minds. We were thinking that way probably because before that the gerbils had died, and the white mice had died, and the salamander. Well, now they know not to carry them around in plastic bags. Of course we expected the tropical fish to die. That was no surprise. Those numbers, you look at them crooked and they're belly up on the surface. But the lesson plan called for a tropical fish input at that point. There was nothing we could do. It happens every year. You just have to hurry past it. We weren't even supposed to have a puppy. We weren't even supposed to have one. It was just a puppy the Murdoch girl found under a Gristed's truck one day, and she was afraid the truck would run over it when the driver had finished making his delivery. So she stuck it in her knapsack and brought it to school with her. So we had this puppy. As soon as I saw the puppy, I thought, oh Christ, I bet it will live for about 2 weeks and that's what it did. It wasn't supposed to be in the classroom at all. There's some kind of regulation about it. But you can't tell them they can't have a puppy when the puppy is already there, right in front of them, running around on the floor and yapping. They named it Edgar. That is, they named it after me. They had a lot of fun running after it and yelling, "Here, Edgar, nice Edgar." Then they'd laugh like hell. They enjoyed the ambiguity. I enjoyed it myself. I don't mind being kidded. They made a little house for it in the supply closet and all that. I don't know what it died of. Distemper, I guess. It probably hadn't had any shots. I got it out of there before the kids got to school. I checked the supply closet each morning routinely because I knew what was going to happen. I gave it to the custodian. And then there was this Korean orphan that the kids adopted through the Help the Children program. All the kids brought in $25 a month. That was the idea. It was an unfortunate thing. The kid's name was Kim, and maybe we adopted him too late or something. The cause of death was not stated in the letter we got. They suggested we adopt another child instead and sent us some interesting case histories, but we didn't have the heart. The class took it pretty hard. They began, I think, nobody ever said anything to me directly, to feel that maybe there was something wrong with the school. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the school particularly. I've seen better and I've seen worse. It was just a run of bad luck. We had an extraordinary number of parents passing away, for instance. There were, I think, 2 heart attacks and 2 suicides, 1 drowning, and 4 killed together in a car accident, 1 stroke, and we had the usual heavy mortality rate among the grandparents, or maybe it was heavier this year. It seemed so. And finally, the tragedy. The tragedy occurred when Matthew Wine and Tony Mavorogordo were playing over where they're excavating for the new federal office building. There were all these big wooden beams stacked, at the edge of the excavation. There's a court case coming out of that. The parents are claiming that the beams were poorly stacked. I don't know what's true and what's not. It's been a strange year. I forgot to mention Billy Brandt's father, who was knifed fatally when he grappled with a masked intruder in his house. One day, we had a discussion in class. They asked me, where did they go? The trees, the salamander, the tropical fish, Edgar, the papas and mamas, Matthew and Tony. Where did they go? And I said, I don't know. And they said, who knows? And I said, nobody knows. And they said, is death that which gives meaning to life? And I said, no, life is that which gives meaning to life. Then they said, but isn't death considered as a fundamental datum, the means by which the taken for granted mundanity of the everyday may be transcended in the direction of, I said, yes, maybe. They said, we don't like it. I said, that's sound. They said, it's a bloody shame. I said, it is. They said, will you make love now with Helen, our teaching assistant, so that we can see how it's done? We know you like Helen. I do like Helen, but I said that I would not. We've heard so much about it, they said, but we've never seen it. I said I would be fired and that it was never, or almost never, done as a demonstration. Helen looked out of the window. They said, please make love with Helen. We require an assertion of value. We are frightened. I said that they shouldn't be frightened, although I am often frightened, and that there was value everywhere. Helen came and embraced me. I kissed her a few times on the brow. We held each other. The children were excited. Then there was a knock on the door. I opened the door, and the new gerbil walked in. The children cheered wildly. Okay, now, this story really kind of threw my students for a loop last semester because you can see that it's building up. There is a kind of arc, right? There are characters and things happening in it. But what actually is happening is Barthelme is constantly building tension. We'll see this. And then kind of dodging the resolution to that tension. The kind of classic, and I'll see if I can draw this on. Okay, I can't draw on this PDF, so I'm going to go over here. The kind of classic way of thinking of fiction is that we have the beginning, right? We have the middle, and then we have the end. And over the course of the story, right, it tends to kind of rise and fall, right? Tension builds, and then there's a moment of crisis somewhere in the story. Usually it comes about 2/3 of the way through the story. And then there's what's called the denouement. It's a nice French word. It's supposed to be an accent. The denouement is the resolution to that conflict, okay? Typically, and this is just kind of standard for most stories, but plot is usually established about 1/3 of the way through, whereas the major conflict comes about 2/3. So really, if we think about it, we have the beginning, we learn about the character, we learn about the setting, we learn about what's going on, and that's when the plot really takes place, okay? Then we have more of that plot. We see the character, right? We see the tension building, pressure's rising, and then the character has this moment about 2/3 of the way through where they have to, address the crisis. Now, whatever that crisis is, okay? So if you look at Barthelme's story, actually, that point where he talks about the tragedy, that's about 2/3 of the way through the story. So that's the moment of, kind of crisis, right? Even though we don't really know what's happening in this story. That's the kind of classic. I think it's called the Freytag triangle, right? This kind of rising tension, denouement, and then resolution. Now, if we think of this story, okay, now what's the plot? Well, it's a trick question. There actually is no plot, okay? Because plot, like I said, when you're creating a story and a character, we think of that character having motivations, right? We think of that character having intentions and desires, things they want of the world, right? The plot, so that if you think of it, like I said the other day in our discussion, if we think of the character's motivations here, wanting this, the plot seeks to meet that and push back. And so there's this constant tension, this constant push-pull between the character's intentions, desires, motivations, and the plot. If the character wants love, we have a love plot, but that doesn't mean that they just instantly find love, right? Because if it's that easy, why do the rest of us struggle with it? So you see, the idea in fiction is to constantly try to work in that sense of agon, okay? That sense of struggle and conflict and even danger. So in this story, if we think of what Barthelme's doing, right? If we think of this kind of model of rising tensions like this, so what happens at the beginning of the story? What's the first thing that died? The orange trees, and then the salamander, or the gerbils, and then the salamander, and then the mice, and then the herb garden, and then, so you see, he's kind of building this tension, and it's all kind of prosaic, right? It's kind of goofy, but notice this, that Barthelme kind of almost realizes in real time, right, as in writing it, that he can't continue with this. It can't just be, and then the superintendent died, and then the principal, and so he does this kind of quick shift to the puppy, right? And so all of these other animals, nobody's really going to lose sleep over a dead herb garden. Nobody's going to lose a lot of sleep over some dead tropical fish. But you throw a puppy in there, and that's now we're moving. Are we moving toward tragedy? Are we moving in that direction? Right. So you see, now the puppy dies, and so the stakes go up again. And then all of a sudden, what happens after the puppy? A Korean orphan dies that they, a human being that they've adopted, and then we just get this long list, right, of all the parents dying and the grandparents, and then we learn that even 2 of the classmates have died, right? So it's almost like this constant building of tension. It's just death. Now, Barthelme is kind of playing the line here between tragedy and comedy. It's clearly not a tragedy, okay? He's using all of this kind of ridiculousness and this absurdity as a comedic vehicle to move the story along, okay? So that's what he's doing structurally. Now, there's this moment, there's this complete, strange, tonal shift, okay? Here, he does a tone shift in this section right here. Let me find it. So we have tragedy, and then Billy Brandt's dad. And notice the tonal shift that happens here. It's all kind of goofy and strange and silly, and yet kind of sad if you think about it. And this discussion. Now, this discussion is probably something that you've had with adults as a child, trying to understand death. It's a very abstract concept. How would we explain death to a child? They don't have the same cognitive abilities that adults do. And even adults, we still grapple and wrestle with death and our own mortality, right? But notice this tonal shift. It gets very, very sincere, where it says, one day we had a discussion. They asked me, where did they go? The trees, the salamander, the tropical fish, Edgar, the papas and mamas, Matthew and Tony. Where did they go? And there's this kind of moment of honesty. I don't know. And they said, who knows? And I said, nobody knows, right? There's this kind of moment of, as adults even, we don't know, we can't comprehend it, right? This strange, terrible fact of just death, and then the contrast of that to being alive and living and enjoying the time we have on this earth. And so, in a way, Barthelme kind of rising tension, and this tonal shift, right? Because he can't keep killing things. He can't keep killing everything. He knows that that's just not how the story should work, okay? And then we have this almost existential question, right? If you've had English 119 with me, and we read Albert Camus, the French Algerian philosopher, this almost sounds like Camus. Life is that which gives meaning to life. That's kind of a beautiful sentiment in a way, right? We can't look to external figures for the meaning of life, because life itself is its own meaning. It's tautological, but it's interesting. So you notice here we have this moment of clear sincerity, and then this other tonal shift, right? Then they said, isn't But isn't death considered as a fundamental datum, the means by which the taken for granted mundanity of the everyday may be transcended in the direction of... You see, kids don't talk like that, right? That's what makes that funny. It's almost like Barthelme saying, whoa, I got to back off this sincerity for a moment, okay? And then kind of change direction. I said, yes, maybe. They said, we don't like it. I said, nah, that makes sense. That's not. They said, it's a bloody shame. No, kids don't talk like that. I said, it is. They said, will you make love now with Helen, our teaching assistant, so that we can see how it is done? We know you like Helen. Once again, he just changes direction. Now, this might seem very random, okay? But in a short story, especially one this short, Barthelme can pull this off, first of all, because he's in total tonal control of the story, but also in control of the overall structure, okay? The overall structure of the story. I do like Helen, but I said that I would not. We've heard so much about it, they said, but we've never seen it. Now, once again, this is just a little, these three words are what makes this part funny. I said I would be fired, and that it was never, or almost never, done as a demonstration. So, you see, that little gesture, that little moment is what makes that funny, okay? Helen looked out of the window. Now, Helen comes in here out of nowhere. We haven't seen her before. She's clearly part of the class. She's been standing around waiting in the wings. Now, here, Helen looked out of the window. What does that tell us, right? They're having this conversation, right? And Helen sort of, turns and looks out the window as if to fake her ignoring of this conversation, right? It's clear that Edgar, the teacher, and Helen, right, are attracted to one another. So notice this, we have this tragic death, and then we have the actual kind of point of the story. It's a love story, right? It's a love story. They said, please make love with Helen. We require an assertion of value. We are frightened. Something children would never say, I would hope. Okay. And then here they embrace, they kiss, they hold each other. The children were excited. Then there was a knock on the door. I opened the door, and the new gerbil walked in. The children cheered wildly. Now, what's this gerbil? Why is this structured in this way? What on earth is Barthelme going on about? So to go back here, okay. Now notice here, just in our little ladder of tensions, right? Tension. It just keeps building because, in part, he doesn't resolve anything that comes before it, right? So even when it becomes kind of a love story, right? Are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? No. Are they? What's going to happen? Are they? So it's constantly building tension, okay? Now, like I said, these are weird tensions. I don't mean danger here. But notice he sets up expectations without resolution, okay? He doesn't resolve the expectations or the tensions. If we think of how this works in movies, right, they'll kind of build tension, and they might have a moment of, tension, like let's say in a horror story, right? We see some of the killer, we see the kids, we see, we don't, and then all of a sudden they meet the killer and maybe he kills one of them. And thereafter, there has to be a little pause, okay? At least in film or TV, a little pause so that the reader or viewer can kind of catch their breath, okay? It's just kind of a standard thing to do. It's also a standard in fiction. But Barthelme he just keeps building tension, and he doesn't resolve it. Now that gerbil, okay, coming in, knocking on the door, and coming in at the last in the last sentence, what is that gerbil? Okay, remember the class has had a ton of animals come into the class and then die. Okay, first of all, I know that gerbils can't knock on doors; they don't walk as if on two legs. That's kind of the image we get in the story, right? The gerbil is, once again, a rising tension, okay? Because, first of all, we know the fate of the gerbil, right? We know it's going to die. Why do the children cheer wildly? Are they sadistic? What is wrong with these kids? Well, remember, we're thinking about this story. It's clearly not a realistic story. So the gerbil comes in, and then the story ends. Why does that continue to build tension, right? Well, because where's the gerbil come from? What's he doing? Are we going to see it die? You see, Barthelme never gives us any resolution to anything that we see in the story. Okay? Now, what that does is he's controlling the reader's mood and the reader's perceptions. Okay? Simply through tone and this constant kind of shift, right? This constant shifting of, well, what's going to happen? Well, how did the dog die, and how did this die, and how did this, right? He's constantly just kind of running around. So here's the expectations. We think it's going to go here, and then he's suddenly, he's kind of going all around these roadblocks, these resolutions that we might have. Okay. Now, let's go back to the title, because titles are really important. And the joke I always make is that in your workshop drafts, okay, you should always put a title on the story. Okay. The poem should always have titles, okay? Even if it's not a great title, because what usually happens is you're going to finish the story and you're going to find the title later. So if you put a title in as a placeholder, okay? And please do not title them untitled, okay? But titles are really important, because if we think of the title versus the story, right? Titles create tensions, okay, between what the title says and what the story's doing, okay? Sometimes titles are, they're just as important as the content of the stories themselves. So if we think of the title of this story, right? The school. Now here, this is clearly not a real school. So what then does this school become? It becomes almost symbolic, okay? We could even think of it in terms of metaphoric. Symbols are basically just complex, highly complex metaphors. Okay, just to give you a sketch of this, because I usually do a talk on this at some point. Meta plus, is it O or A? I think it's A. I think it's photos. So meta and photos in Greek means to, this means kind of like over and then to carry. So a metaphor carries meaning across. Actually, here's a fun etymology. In Latin, the word translatio, where we get our word translation, this actually means metaphor. And so here we can see the same basic etymology, right? Trans or meta, okay? And then latio from, I think it's ladere. I think this actually might be where our word ladder comes from. Don't quote me on that, but that would be my guess, that it has something to do. It clearly has a relationship to latitude and all this. But this, in Latin, translatio means metaphor. So to translate something is to carry meaning across from language X to language Y. Okay? So metaphors carry meaning over from one thing to the other. Okay? And metaphors are actually very powerful. They're actually also really common just in how we think. There's a good book by George Lakoff called Metaphors We Live By. So if you want to go check this out, I think there's another one called, I think it's called Embodied Nature, if I remember correctly. It's something like this, okay, in which he argues that a lot of metaphors like up, down, light, dark, right, these kind of primal metaphors are actually part of our mental vocabulary of how we see the world, and that's based on our evolutionary history, etc. Anyway, so the school, the title, okay, is almost metaphoric. Because if we think of school, what do we think of when we go to school? We think of education, we think of socialization, we think of learning, we think of assignments and all of that, okay? But this is clearly not what's happening in this school. The kids are learning, okay, but what are they really learning about? The whole thing opens up with death. Death, 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 okay? There's a moment of crisis where the kids ask the teacher, Edgar, what's going on? What is death? And he says, I don't know, nobody knows. And then the story pivots to love, okay? Now, these are the two central themes of this story, and this is done through comedy, okay? Now, it's kind of darkly comic if you stop and think about it, but the way that Barthelme writes and structures it, okay, he can kind of pull that off, okay? So see, these are the two major themes. Now, if we think of the school metaphorically, right, what could it be a metaphor of if we're dealing with death and love? Well, that sounds a lot like the things we deal with in life. So we think of the school. Now, I don't mean the school of life and all of this, but I mean, it gets kind of there, right? So because in life, we know that we are going to die. We know that our loved ones are going to die. And, we try to find love and value, and we try to assert those values as much as we can in the face of a constant and never-ending, tragedy. People dying all around us, horrible things happening to good people, the kind of randomness that embodies, right? So I think those are the major themes in this story. And that's kind of what Barthelme is aiming at, okay? We try to find love. The teacher finds love kind of randomly with Helen, right, the TA. Now, in this story, okay, and this is something that we'll talk about maybe a little bit later too. For your stories, okay, when you're doing world building. Now, this is something that, since a lot of you are probably going to be doing science fiction or fantasy, world building is really, really, really important, okay? Because you have to establish early in the story what are the rules of the world or story that you're building, okay? Darko Suvin, a literary critic, called this the zero world. Okay, so what are the rules of this world of your story? You have to establish that within the first, 1 to 4 pages. So if there are unicorns, let's say flying unicorns, okay, in this world, get a flying unicorn into the story pretty early on. Because in world building, if we don't see, the fantastical elements early on, it defaults to our world. Okay, that's the default setting in fiction. It's going to default to our world until we are shown otherwise. So, if your character wakes up, let's make her look a little bit sleepy. She wakes up, she looks out the window and she sees what? Maybe some palm trees. Maybe the ocean. That's a boat. It's kind of hard to draw on. It's kind of hard to draw something when you can't look at your own hand, which is what this program requires. So she sees some palm trees. She sees the ocean. Oh, how beautiful. And then, there goes a flying unicorn. I'm not even going to bother trying to draw one. Maybe I will. Okay. Yes, a flying unicorn. So she looks out and she sees this flying unicorn. So we're trying to establish, let's name her Ophelia. Why not? We'll do a little literary reference to Shakespeare. Um, Ophelia had been up for 3 hours doing her homework. She finished the final pages of her first draft for Dr. Hellberg's creative writing class. She looked out the window at the clear blue Pacific waters, watching the palm trees sway in the wind. A boat, probably some rich tourist, sailed off toward the horizon. Ophelia thought that someday she would like to be on a boat like that, but only if she got through school. A flying unicorn, or so you could even create a specific name for them, whatever that be. A flying unicorn swept by, smashed into a palm tree, and fell to the ground. Good Lord, Ophelia thought, those damn things are nothing but a nuisance. We thought the pigeons were bad, right? We thought the pigeons were bad, but these things are far worse. So what we're doing very quickly is trying to establish that we're not in our world. So we can have parts of it, like maybe this is Nassau, right? But there are other elements, like the unicorn, that don't fit into our world, okay? So that's kind of the point of world building. And you notice that very early on, Barthelme sets up the rules of his story, that we know that we're in a world similar to ours, but it's not our world directly. Okay, and this is pretty much what Barthelme does over and over and over again, because he is what we would consider something of an absurdist writer. And so with the absurd, right, the absurd, if you go and read Camus and existentialism, is that we look to the world for fixed meaning. What is justice? What is love? Why do we die? Does God exist? All that stuff. Okay. So we look to the world for meaning. We look to rationality. We want the world to make sense, even though most of life and most of what we face in the world is irrational. Okay. And so the institutions that we thought, would give our lives meaning end up demonstrating that they can't give our lives meaning. So in a sense, to kind of drop these names because I teach them in other classes, in a way, the two philosophers most associated with this idea, Albert Camus and Soren Kierkegaard, he was Algerian, he was from Denmark. They talk about this idea that for Kierkegaard, rationality, okay, can't give our lives meaning. So therefore, he was a devout Christian. He said that faith is the thing that gives our lives meaning, even though, right, we know that faith, right, it's a faith. It's not a fact. Okay, faith works differently than science, for example. Camus changes this. He kind of gives a secular version of Kierkegaard's view of faith, but they both believed in what they called the absurd, okay? That the meaning of life is really hard to define. We all have an individual meaning that we give life, okay? And that's the best we can hope for, okay? Kierkegaard actually is the one who came up with the term, the leap of faith, okay? He says that because rationality will only take us so far. And so in a sense, you have to take that leap right off the cliff into faith, into God's hands. Camus secularizes that message, but they both have the same basic core. So what are the rules of life, so to speak, to go back to Barthelme? And I'll end this here in a moment. What are the rules of life? There's really only one rule. Think about it. What are the rules of life? Is life fair? Is everybody equal? Does everybody get what they deserve? Is everybody rich? Is life easy? Does everybody find love? You know, do children get hurt? Do children die? Do children get sick? Do our parents die? You know, it's like, man, it's brutal, right? So the only real rule of life is death, and in that sense, it makes death a kind of democratic institution because we all get to participate, and it's in contrast to that, right? It's in contrast to that I think that Barthelme wants us to see, in his own weird way, that even though death, right, is constantly kind of pushing down on everything we do, we struggle in our lives to kind of overcome that. We struggle to put that away. We struggle to enjoy, you know. We struggle, even though we have all these absurd things, you know, gerbils dying, fish dying, kids asking weird questions and wanting to see the TA and the teacher hook up, right? The absurdity that makes up life is the very thing that gives it meaning and the very thing that makes it beautiful, okay? So I think that's kind of the point if we had to take a thematic reading of Barthelme, because if we take a literal reading of him, it doesn't make any sense. The story is too strange. So we take a thematic and metaphoric reading, okay, that this school of life idea, as I think what Barthelme is pushing towards, okay? So that's a kind of brief discussion. Now, when I said that the story was plotless, okay, do not try a plotless story in your own, okay? Figure out characters who want things, okay? And then the plot will lean on that such that it creates, like I said, it creates that kind of arch, okay? And this is something that you just have to work on and develop. You probably will never have a plot in your story until it's about 3 to 4 drafts in, because you'll have to figure out, well, what does my character want? What do they desire? And then you'll figure out the plot, okay? So that's just a basic overview of Barthelme's story, The School. I use it because I really like it. It's really short. It's very funny. And it's a good example of what I don't want you to do just yet. Okay, I want you to try to build stories that have plots, because until you can write a story with a convincing plot and human characters that tells a compelling story, it's almost impossible to do a really good plotless story. So I'll do a couple more on Barthelme here and post those when I can. So I hope this helps. I hope you like Barthelme. I really like him, and maybe you do too.